I call this better to ask forgiveness. So these are the years from 1683 to 1714. It's really my choice to stop at 1714 for a couple of reasons, which will become obvious. But this is the almost 100-year story of Tun Tavern. These are the first, 30 years or so, but they're important years. It really all starts with a gentleman called William Penn. You've heard of him. Uh, I call him scholar, scofflaw, Quaker, statesman, developer, and dreamer. He is key in making Tun Tavern happen for a number of reasons, which will become clearer as we get through this. Most important, and what got him here, is his father, Admiral Sir William Penn. Admiral William Penn was a very, very successful sea captain, and you'll understand in a moment why. So Penn's early life, he was born to wealthy parents. He got the finest educational opportunities handed to him. He got into Oxford, but was expelled because he didn't like to get up for morning prayer services. So with him coming back home, his father sent him to Paris to mature, as he says. And Penn really learns French culture and enjoys it much more than British culture, and he returns as a gentleman. Penn's father is pleased with how his son has matured. He sends him to Ireland to manage his large estates there. In Ireland, William Penn meets Quakers. They are preaching in a field, and he likes what they have to say. And eventually he joins the Quaker faith. If you know anything about the Quaker faith, I am not a Quaker, but they are everywhere in Pennsylvania, particularly in the Philadelphia area. Quakers were not well liked in Britain or, in fact, anywhere else in Europe for some reasons that you'll see in a moment. But jumping ahead, his father dies in 1670, and Penn inherits the monarchy's huge financial debt to his father. As I mentioned, Quakers are despised and imprisoned just for meeting in private homes and praying together. Penn, as a newly minted Quaker, uses his education and position to free imprisoned Quakers, and the Quakers sort of see him as their champion. So Penn's father, Admiral Sir William Penn, is an aggressive, successful ship's captain and later an admiral, and accumulates significant wealth in the wars against the Dutch and the Spanish. How does he do this? He does it because rules at the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, the centuries of sailing ships, were very different than they are today. When two countries were at war, all of the shipping of the opposite of the enemy country was considered fair game, merchant ships especially. So if you capture a merchant ship, you take that ship to a friendly port, you sell the ship and everything on it, and you keep the money, you being the captain of the ship, and you split it with your crew. It's legal piracy. You had a letter of marque if you were not in the military, but military ships could do this. And things called privateers, which were essentially legal pirates, they would get permission from their government, and they would get a letter from their government that had specific dates when they could act on the government's behalf and attack enemy shipping. The privateers usually preyed on merchant ships, who were far more plentiful than military ships. But on occasion, they actually did go up against military ships and occasionally would win. The letter of marque that they carried was really important because that would stop you from getting hung. Pirates were hung, and if you had a letter of marque, you weren't officially a pirate. You were working under the leadership or the auspices of your government. So that was not technically piracy. So Admiral Penn fights in 3 wars, right, 2.5 wars with the Dutch, and does very well. The Dutch were the merchants and the bankers of Europe, so their boats were loaded with a lot of money. And then the Spanish coming across the Caribbean with silver and gold that they had gotten, I suppose, is a way to say it, in Central and South America, they became targets for English shipping as well. And later, the pirates of the Caribbean, as we all know, they were actually just, piracy came out of this legal system that everyone was using with these privateers. And when the war ended, the government said, okay, no more privateering, but that's all these guys knew how to do. So they just continued as pirates. And that's where the piracy comes from. So back to Quakerism. Quaker principles in the 1600s, most people know, was nonviolence, no military service. They didn't swear, including oaths of allegiance to the king. They had very simple lifestyle, simple clothing, simple foods, simple living. So that sort of did not endear them to certainly not to the British monarchy. They refused to do military service, and everyone questioned their allegiance to the king. Their simple lifestyle meant they didn't spend a lot of money on clothing, and so they started to accumulate wealth. They had some other teachings that were really seen as radical. The Quaker faith was not led by priests, bishops, or even ministers. The Quaker religion holds that you don't need a minister or a bishop or a priest to teach you how to pray. God is in your heart, and it's between you and God, and you don't need a church. So they never had priests or ministers or bishops in the Quaker faith. They have no requirement to contribute money to the church. The Anglican Church, of which the King of England is the head, after they separated from the Roman Catholic Church, the English citizens were required to join the Anglican Church and give tithing, 10% of their income in the form of cash and or goods to the church. And the head of the church is the King of England. Suddenly, all these people are flocking to Quakerism, and the king's coffers are getting smaller and smaller. He's not too happy with Quakers either. Quakers also believe all men and women are equal, and they permitted them to and encouraged them to practice free speech. That often landed them in prison, and that's where William Penn was busy getting them out of prison. Later, Quakers did have slaves in America, but later slavery should be abolished, became a very strong Quaker tenet. And they also had this idea of trial by jury of peers, which was unheard of. The king's judges determined if you were guilty or innocent, but Quakers believed in a trial by jury of your peers. One last thing about Quakers, the influence. The Quakers influenced in American history. The Articles of Confederation that were done by the colonies were based on the Quaker documents in Pennsylvania that were used to draw up essentially the Constitution for Pennsylvania. The United States Constitution has items in it that clearly come from Quaker documents: religious liberty, the separation of church and state, 2 houses of Congress. Quakers thought it was very, very important that one part of the government represent the states or the individual colonies, and the other represent the people, the Congress and the Senate, or the House of Representatives and the Senate. Checks on power. They believed in very strong checks on executive power. And in the Quaker beliefs, the constitutional supremacy led over everything. Most important thing was the Constitution, not individual power of elected officials. From a consumer point of view, you've heard of companies that the Quakers started: Lloyd's of London, Barclays, the bank, and Cadbury chocolates, all began by Quakers. So back to our pal, William Penn. He, as I mentioned, his father became quite rich and quite successful as an admiral, and I explained why, because as he would capture enemy shipping, he would keep the treasure of it and share it with the government. But he amassed many millions of dollars in fortune. A gentleman named Oliver Cromwell came along and decided England no longer needed a king. And so they literally cut the king's head off, and Cromwell took over as the ruler of England, creating a republic of sorts. But it really turned into a dictatorship. So for about 10 years, Cromwell ran England. He died, and his son took his place. And the English decided they weren't in for another monarchy of Cromwell's. So they removed Cromwell's son and decided to reinstate the King of England. The Duke of York was Charles II. He had fled to Amsterdam when they cut his brother's head off to save his own neck. William Penn's father, like other wealthy military people, decided to reinstate the king, and they financed the return of the king to England. For that, the king owed William Penn's father a tremendous amount of money. Estimates are somewhere in the $7 to $8 million range, and the king had a title and a crown, but no treasury, so he could not repay Penn's father. And this is $4 million in today's currency. That's a lot of money back in England when the average admiral's salary was about $100 a month. So Admiral Penn dies, and William Penn, his oldest son, inherits this huge IOU from the King of England. Someone in the king's court, perhaps the king himself, thought of an elegant solution. Although he was not hostile to Quakers, England still was, and suddenly they had all this land in North America, and they had these pesky Quakers who were starting to get more power in England and decide that they weren't going to follow the rules. So they decided, Mr. Penn, why don't you and your Quaker pals go to America and set up your own colony, and you'll be under our protection. And it's this place just up the Delaware River. There's some Swedish and Dutch settlements there. Go up past them, and that's land west of New Jersey along the river. You can claim that, you can develop it, and you can govern it. And Penn says, this is wonderful. I'll call it Sylvania. And the king says, there's one condition. Your father made all this possible, so let's call it Pennsylvania. And so Pennsylvania is named after William Penn's father, not William Penn himself, as most Pennsylvanians believe. So William Penn sails up the Delaware. It took him, interestingly enough, 57 days to cross the Atlantic because of storms. 57 days ago, you were probably celebrating Memorial Day. So think about how much time that would be sitting on a ship with about 300 people on this ship that had smallpox. So it was quite the brutal cruise for them. They came up the Delaware Bay, and they encountered Dutch settlers and Swedish settlers, none of whom spoke English. What's interesting here, it's the Delaware itself on the side of the river that we now call Delaware. Then it was part of the Duke of York's area, but it was claimed by the Dutch before the English ever set foot there. The Swedes, the Kingdom of Sweden, decided they wanted to have some presence in the New World, so they sent their boats over, and they landed on the Dutch territory. Now, the Dutch were kind of busy up in what we call New York. They called New Amsterdam, up there building that colony. But they had this colony along the banks of the Delaware River, and they also called that New Netherlands. The Swedes came and brought with them, because they had heard about the forests here, they brought with them subjects who were part of the Empire of Sweden, but they were the Finns. Finland hadn't been created yet, but these Finns, the forest Finns as they were called, were particularly adept and good at building structures rather quickly, and structures that were very useful and simple and strong and could withstand the harsh winters here. So Sweden makes a settlement there. The Netherlands hear of these Swedes coming in, squatting on their land, and I call them the Angry Dutch. They send a couple of warships down from what we would call New York. They sail up the bay and threaten the Swedes, and the Swedes fight for a little bit and then move inland, and the Dutch sail away. The Swedes come back later with their ships, and they build a fort in what we call present-day Wilmington. This angers the Dutch again, so the Dutch come back down with even more warships, and they force the Swedes to abandon the fort, and the Dutch build their own fort between the Swedish fort and the river. Not next door to it, but close enough, and that cuts the Swedes' access off to the river, which really is what they need for trade. So the Swedes then decide to take the fort. So they come back and capture take the Dutch fort from the Dutch. There's no bloodshed. It's all done rather quietly. And the word gets back to the Dutch in 1655 that the Swedes have taken their fort. The Dutch come back down with even more gunboats and force the Swedes out of the fort. But these are the benevolent Dutch. They do something that's really odd and really unheard of before. They allowed the Swedes to stay, and they allow them to keep their own language, Swedish, and in some cases Finnish, and they allow them to keep their customs, and they allow them to practice their religion, a very strange religion called Presbyterianism. So today you will find in Delaware and parts of Pennsylvania, a lot of Swedes and Finnish names are in our population. Interesting to note that the first IKEA in North America was in Philadelphia and still is in Philadelphia. I guess the Swedes felt as though it was a friendly place for them. Finally, in 1664, England arrives, and our friend William Penn sails up the river. When he sails up the river, he first finds these Swedish settlements, and they introduce them to the Hirsimoki. And the Hirsimoki are all around the woodlands, and they're really proud of these Hirsimoki. Penn thought they were rather interesting dwellings. You and I have probably been in one. We know them as log cabins. Log cabins were invented by the Finns, and because they were forest people, they could build them rather quickly, and they were all through Delaware and southern New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Wherever the Swedes went, they would build these Hirsimokis. If you come to Philadelphia, you can still see an original one. There's one built in 1638 that still exists. There's a picture of it there on the left. They built a small house next to it about 200 years ago that adjoins it. But the original log cabin is still there. It's still functional. It's now a museum owned by an old couple who run it as a museum. It's just along the roadside in a place called Gibbstown, New Jersey, which is right across the river from Delaware, and very close to a place called Finn's Point. So back to William Penn. He cruises up the Delaware, further up the Delaware, past the Swedish settlements, and comes to a place called Upland. Today it's called Chester. It was the first English settlements on the Delaware River, and it had been there for about 10 years before Penn arrived. This is technically not in Delaware. This is north of what land that the Dutch claimed. So it's in this land that was owned by England, part of this Pennsylvania. Penn arrives and he says, "I'm your new governor." And they said, "You're the Penn the Quaker, right?" "This is really not a Quaker settlement. You need to keep going up the river. We really don't want your Quaker people to settle here." So Penn does continue to sail up the river. And he gets to a point where the river turns, and this is what he sees. He sees the river had taken a hard turn and carved out an embankment over the millennia and exposed a 40 and 50-foot cliff, and the sediment had fallen into the Delaware. Excuse me. And his ship was called the Welcome, by the way. So he decides, I'll put my city up there on top of that bluff. So that is going to be the location of Philadelphia. The problem is it's October. Winter's coming rather quickly. October in Philadelphia can be warm, but it can also be very chilly. So they need a place to live. So the Indians teach these Quakers how to live and dig caves into the sides of this riverbed. And they start to dig caves in there. And they dig about a dozen caves up and down that cliff there. It's about a 40 or 50-foot cliff. And these caves become the homes for these people until they can build their own settlement homes up on top of that bluff where those trees are. So that for the first really 20 or so years, the new arrivals in Philadelphia lived in the caves until they could find a house or build a house up above where everyone else was. So if William Penn had come up the Delaware now, this is what he would see. Those caves are that concrete wall to the left side. There's an underpass there that they're actually tearing off right now. That's what this picture's taken of. So where those cars are, that's Interstate 95, that's where the Delaware River was. That concrete wall on the left is covering the exposed cliff that was there when Penn came up. So meanwhile, in Barbados, a young Quaker with a small inheritance that he received from his father in Horsham, England, in 1671, leaves for Barbados to seek his fortune in the most valuable commodity of the 17th century, sugar. Sugar drove the European economy, and Caribbean sugar was better than anything they could get in Africa, and much less expensive than the sugar they were buying from the Arab countries. So Barbados has the perfect soil and the perfect climate to grow sugar. It's one of the most prolific sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean, and it becomes a very strategic island for that reason. It changes hands 3 times. First, the Spanish take it, then the French take it from the Spanish, and then the English take it from the French. So it has a military garrison on there, but it needs to be augmented by a local militia. The young Quaker's name is Samuel Carpenter. In 10 years, he becomes one of the most successful sugar traders in the Caribbean. He makes a considerable fortune in trading sugar. But he's a Quaker, and the locals already don't like him because he's a Quaker, and then he refuses to let his men join the militia. He doesn't contribute to the Anglican Church. He keeps his money. So they fine him in tons of sugar, many, many tons of sugar, and occasionally they burn his warehouses because they see him as disloyal to the king. So after hearing of William Penn's appointment as the governor and developer of the new colony in North America, Carpenter avoids a new round of fines, which I believe was 7 tons of sugar, and tells the local authorities, if I leave, will you wipe out this fine? They agree to do that. He cashes out his holdings and leaves Barbados for Penn's new colony. This happens just in time because Penn is in a really difficult position. He has the authority to develop Pennsylvania, to sell the lands, to do whatever he needs to do to develop it, but he's got to develop it with his own money. The British monarchy is not giving him money to build infrastructure in this new colony, and he's struggling to find investors in his new colony. Mr. Carpenter leaves Barbados with millions in cash. Some estimates are $14 to $15 million in cash currency, and he arrives in what will become Philadelphia just in time to help Penn with his, as it's known, the holy experiment. Carpenter is by far the wealthiest person in Pennsylvania, and he starts to invest heavily in Pennsylvania. He buys huge tracts of land. He becomes Penn's treasurer because it's mostly his money. He invests in public projects that improves the infrastructure of Pennsylvania and especially Philadelphia. And for those things, he is allowed to purchase some pretty prime real estate in Philadelphia. That's right along the river itself. He buys a 250-foot section of Philadelphia's waterfront right in the heart of the activity along the waterfront. William Penn and Samuel Carpenter become partners in multiple ventures, and he's a very trusted friend and advisor to William Penn for the rest of their lives. The resulting change in fortune for Pennsylvania are immediate. The Quakers all around the world start to flock to Philadelphia, Quakers in Europe and in England. As many as 6 to 10 ships are arriving every week in Philadelphia. How you unloaded ships then is you rowed out in your rowboat to the ship and you started to take people and goods off of the ship and you rowed back to shore. Carpenter sees a real business opportunity. So he builds the first pier into the Delaware River, and it's a rather large pier. Now, this is important because William Penn had said, no one owns the river, so you will not build piers and you will not block anyone's access to the river. Well, essentially, Carpenter was doing that by building his structures along that. So they came to a compromise where Penn said you need to leave at least a cartway available for everyday Philadelphians to access the river. And so Carpenter did do an 11-foot wide cartway alongside his buildings that went right to the Delaware River. He builds his pier there. It's quite a large pier. Ships of, they say, 600 tons can tie up to it. Penn comes back and he's a bit upset because this pier is there and warehouses there, and he didn't say they could do this, but it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And this becomes a significant thing. Everyone else is watching and waiting to see what Penn will do. And he decides to forgive Carpenter, and other people then take it upon themselves to build piers into the Delaware, and a waterfront is created. So Carpenter builds his pier. He puts warehouses on the pier for goods coming and going to Europe. And at the end of the pier, he builds a tavern, Tun Tavern. He is joined in Philadelphia by his brother shortly after his arrival. And his brother, Joshua Carpenter, is a master brewer. And this becomes very important. So Samuel Carpenter, as I mentioned, a trusted friend and partner of William Penn and a financier of the early infrastructure of Pennsylvania. His brother Joshua comes in 1686. The brothers are actually quite close. Actually, they're half brothers, different mothers. Joshua's mother died earlier, and Samuel was born to Mr. Carpenter's second wife. So they grew up together, and Joshua was a few years older than Samuel, but nonetheless, they are close. Joshua comes and joins his brother Samuel in Philadelphia. Samuel sells Joshua the lot next to his, along his 250-foot waterfront. And it appears as though Samuel had already started building something. He built his own house right on the river, and it's a brick house, and it becomes quite famous because of the way it's designed. And next to it, there is another building. And we know there's another building because there's a letter from Robert Turner to William Penn in 1685, talks about the progress in Philadelphia. Samuel Carpenter has built, he mentions first, Samuel has built a lime burner that we're all using to make bricks for our house. Samuel has built his own house of brick and is building another house next to his. I suspect that may have been, or that may be the building that becomes Tun Tavern. In 1686, Joshua Carpenter, now in Philadelphia, is licensed to operate an ordinary. An ordinary is another name for a tavern. There's different types of tavern. There's tippling houses, there's ordinaries, and there's taverns. Taverns offered food, ordinaries offered drink, but they were all legal. Tippling houses are a little less legal, but they got away with them because they sold alcohol in very small quantities. So Joshua gets a license to operate an ordinary in his brother Samuel's house, according to the records in the Philadelphia archives. So I believe it's the house next to Samuel's own home. And so the question with Tun Tavern that often comes up is it built in 1686 or in 1693? I used to think it was 1693, but then I learned why 1693 keeps coming up. 1693 was the first year that tax records were kept for Philadelphia, or Pennsylvania for that matter. So the first year Tun Tavern appears in the Philadelphia legal roll books as a tax-paying entity is 1693. That's because everyone appeared in 1693. It's the first time businesses are recorded. But it's clear that he also got his permit to operate an ordinary and his brother's house in 1686. So I believe Tun Tavern and Joshua started their business in 1686. So Joshua Carpenter makes a name for himself as a master brewer and becomes very wealthy, selling his beer and ale to the growing number of taverns in the new settlement. He is not a Quaker. He's an Anglican church member. And although he and Samuel are close, he does not join the Quaker faith. He stays with the Anglican faith and becomes so wealthy that he is able to purchase land and donate it to the first Anglican church built in Philadelphia, Christ Church. The church still stands, although I believe the church that's there now was built in the the mid 1700s. The first church that stood on that ground that Joshua helped finance was too small and replaced with a larger brick church that's there today. So Joshua Carpenter himself becomes very famous. He becomes a magistrate for Philadelphia. He and Penn do not get along as well. They sort of come to arguing about usually tax issues, but he's not a big fan of Penn, but there's pretty good evidence that William Penn really liked beer quite a lot. One of the first things he did when he arrived in Philadelphia, in what would become Philadelphia, was pour himself a beer. So there's pretty good evidence, that circumstantial evidence, that he probably had a beer or more in his friend's tavern, because Samuel Carpenter, his friend, was essentially the owner or part owner of Tun Tavern with Joshua. And there's probably a pretty good chance that William Penn also drank beer in Tun Tavern. You've all seen the images of Tun Tavern. Looks like this place behind me in my picture here. The strange part about these images is none of those images that we all know as Tun Tavern were drawn 100 years before the tavern was torn down. And it was torn down and didn't burn down. So all of the images of Tun Tavern that we know were drawn 100 years after the tavern was gone. The very earliest drawing is dated somewhere in the late 1800s. Tun Tavern was gone by 1781. So there were really, I thought, no images of Tun Tavern that exist until I found this. This is a painting that hangs in the Library Company of Philadelphia. The Library Company of Philadelphia was the first library in really North America, certainly in Philadelphia, and it was a subscription. In other words, you paid dues to belong to the library and you could borrow books. What's interesting about this artwork was done by a painter in 1714, and then sent to England to make prints with prints from it. The prints were apparently never made, and the painting was found in a junk shop, what they call a curiosity shop in London. So the ambassador to England at the time was someone who had been the vice president of the United States, George Dallas, who I believe is the person that who Dallas, Texas is named for, oddly enough. So this British diplomat knew that Mr. Dallas was from Philadelphia, had been the mayor of Philadelphia at one point. So he picked this up for just a couple of pennies and brought it to Mr. Dallas. Mr. Dallas thought it was really a curiosity, and he sent it to the Library Company of Philadelphia. They did the research and realized how old this painting is. This is verified as the oldest known painting of any North American city that exists in the world. Of particular interest, there is a key that comes with this. The artist's name is Peter Cooper, and in the bottom, you can't really see it on this one, but on the bottom, there is a key that names most of the buildings that he has numbered. And as I mentioned, Samuel Carpenter's house was a really famous house because he put a cupola on top so he could observe his ships coming up and down the Delaware. He would become a shipping magnate, and he wanted to see his ships coming into port. So that the building there with the 15 that's circled in red, that is Samuel Carpenter's house. And it's shown in multiple images of the city at that time. It was quite a famous house, a very tall house, as you can see. It's 4 or 5 stories tall. Right next to it, just to the left of it, is a small brick building that looks an awful lot like a tavern to me. That would have been right next to his house, as it mentions before. We don't know that that is Tun Tavern because it is not named. However, the gray building to the left of that, that large gray building that looks like a barn, is tagged as Joshua Carpenter's store. So either the front, this may be the gray thing, may be the back of Tun Tavern. I suspect it's more warehouse than tavern, or it may have been where he actually brewed the beer, and the tavern was a separate building. But there's pretty good evidence that later in the decades that followed, Tun Tavern was expanded, and eventually, probably it seems, the tavern and the warehouses were joined to allow for large groups to hold events there. Pirates became an issue. Samuel Carpenter's own ships were attacked by pirates. Philadelphia was the largest city in North America, and had attracted the attention of pirates who sat in Delaware Bay. Carpenter takes huge losses because of pirates, and he covers them by selling his assets. Interesting, pirates, they have left the Caribbean because they visited Philadelphia because they knew Quakers didn't believe in capital punishment, and they wouldn't be hung in Philadelphia. There's pretty good circumstantial evidence that Blackbeard the pirate once visited Philadelphia himself in 1713 because people identified him as shopping in a local shop. We knew he liked rum, and Tun Tavern had lots of rum. And we come to the end. In 1714, the next generation of Carpenter ownership takes over the Tun. Joshua Carpenter sells the Tun to his son Samuel, who was named after his uncle, so he's Samuel II. And the deed describes the property for the first time as commonly called or known by the name of the Sign of the Tun, with a brew house and a store located east of the tavern. Samuel Carpenter II is identified as a brewer in the deed, and this suggests that he was already the proprietor of Tun Tavern.